Found Duckling by EvaDragon, Chapter 22. Third time isn't the charm. Summary. Danny and Tim get kidnapped by Scarecrow. Danny scares Scarecrow. Notes. Mild T/W. 2 paragraphs detailing some of Danny's time in captivity with the GIW. Notes from me and not author. I will, when that scene comes up, put a disclaimer. If you want to skip specifically that part, I will give you a timestamp and all of that. That's all. Now on to the chapter. Tim and Danny walked into the coffee shop where Danny worked. It was almost reminiscent of their first meeting as Tim and Danny, if Danny hadn't been leaning against Tim to help keep Danny upright, or if Danny wasn't wearing a paper face mask. After everything that Danny had been through in the last couple of months, he almost felt like he was coming down with either ghost flu, again, regular flu, or even walking pneumonia. Which actually helped with why they were now walking into Danny's coffee shop. Hey Perla, is Martin or Grandy in? I need to talk to one of them, Danny said a little breathlessly, as a cough threatened to rattle around in his chest. The barista looked up at Danny, alarmed, and about jumped the counter. Yeah, actually, they're both here. I'll go get them. Siéntate, idiota, before you hurt yourself. She ran around the counter and grabbed Danny's arm and pulled him to his usual corner booth and plopped him down. Tim smiled indulgently at her. He knew that Danny looked rough, and Danny had admitted to feeling as rough as he looked. Tim and Danny didn't have to wait long for the managers that Danny had asked for to come out from the back of the coffee shop. Martin was a young 20-something young man with hints of an Asian accent. He claimed that he was from somewhere in the South Pacific, but he also liked to make jokes that he was like Heinz 57, a mix of everything from Asia, a little Chinese, a little Japanese, and a little Filipino. Danny never knew if he was serious, so he never laughed at those jokes. Grady was a broad-shouldered African-American who definitely should have been making bank playing defensive linebacker for the Gotham Knights, as he stood at an impressive 6'7" tall and had the muscles to back it up. But he always claimed that the smell of fresh-made coffee calmed something in his soul, while the thought of violence, Danny snorted at that since he lived in Gotham, of all places, almost made him cry. But Grady had been owner/manager of Blacker Than My Soul for almost 4 years, and in that time, it had only been subjected to a single robbery, and that had been near the start of its opening. Grady didn't count rogue attacks because those affected all of Gotham. Hey Danny, you doing okay? Martin asked with concern. Danny definitely looked rough. His hair lacked its usual luster, his eye bags had eye bags, and Martin could hear just the tiniest rattle when Danny breathed. He was concerned. Danny had been an almost model employee. He hardly ever called in or missed work, even with the 800 million rogue attacks that Gotham suffered. Not really. That's kind of why I'm here, Danny said with a sigh. Tim reached into his pocket and pulled out the carefully worded note from Dr. Tompkins. It explained that Danny had contracted basically walking pneumonia, which explained the face mask. Grady took the note while Martin read it over Grady's shoulder. They were both silent for a moment before Martin grunted. Tim snorted. It was such a Batman-esque snort that Tim couldn't help it. Both older men looked up from the note and truly studied Danny for a moment. Martin reread the note and then nodded sharply. The two men looked at each other in unspoken agreement. Danny, you're one of the best workers we have, so you take whatever time you need. We'll make it work. If you think you're feeling up for a shift, just come in. If not, just text us an update, Grady said with an air of finality. Thank you. I didn't really want to quit. I kind of like working here, but the last couple of months have been stressful, personal-wise. Maybe once I get over whatever this is. Danny knew that he'd feel better come January 1st, once the horrible Christmas season came to an end. I can come back to full-time. No rush, Danny. Take care of yourself, Martin said and clapped Danny on the shoulder as he got up from where he'd sat down. Then he walked back to the back of the cafe because he'd seen a bus park nearby and knew that the cafe was about to get slammed. Perla brought both Tim and Danny a deathspresso made to Danny's specifications. Both teens profusely thanked her, but she merely rolled her eyes. Dios mío, 2 caffeinated putas, just what the world needs, she muttered under her breath as she walked away from the table. Danny gave her a grin, even if she couldn't see it. The 2 boys took their drinks and walked out of the cafe. The 2 brothers ambled slowly down the street, not in any big hurry to get back to the manor. Technically, only Danny lived at the manor full-time, as Tim had long since moved out. But Tim found he'd been spending more time in the manor in the last few months. It probably had a lot to do with Danny's presence. In fact, as they walked, Danny leaning a bit more on his older brother, Tim reflected. It absolutely had everything to do with Danny. Danny had brought them together in so many ways. He'd cured Jason of his pit rage. He'd made Damien less stabby. He'd even managed to make Bruce, of all people, start using his actual words. Even Dick had been acting weird, or well, weird for Dick. The sound of screeching tires broke both boys out of their reverie. Neither had time to react before the van came to a halt right next to them, and several goons with burlap sacks on their heads jumped out of the black van and grabbed both of them. Tim and Danny both fought back, but they were simply overwhelmed by sheer numbers. The last thing that both boys saw and heard was something hard being hit to the back of their heads. Fucking damn it, again? Danny thought as his thoughts faded to black and his body went limp. Tim was the first one to consciousness, which wasn't really surprising, considering Danny really was coming down with something. He'd been put through the ringer since joining the Wayne family, but he hadn't once complained about it. It was almost like he expected his life to go tits up at a drop of a dime, and wasn't that just sad? And why was there a pink circus elephant floating above his head? He hadn't watched Dumbo in years. He took another look around, and when he saw the windows were now below him, he realized that he had a concussion. Great. He heard Danny groan. Tim didn't dare shake his head, knowing that would make the pain in his head worse. Danny, Tim called, trying to get his brother's attention. Fiku, came the muffled response. Tim wasn't sure what language Danny had resorted to, but a cuss was still recognizable regardless of the language. Although if Danny was no longer cussing in English, that likely meant he also had a concussion. Danny, Tim called again. Ah, the brothers are awake, I see, came a disjointed voice. Both boys looked around and squinted into the darkness. Danny was the first to recognize the voice. Are you fucking kidding me? It had to be the farmer's reject, Danny bit out. Tim hissed. You dare to insult me, boy? Scarecrow came up to Danny and grabbed his chin. Don't touch him, Tim snarled, but Scarecrow ignored the older Wayne boy. Oh, but I have so many plans for the both of you. I have a new fear toxin that I've been waiting to try. Shall we get started? Scarecrow crooned. He snapped his hand out, and one of his goons brought him 2 canisters. Scarecrow made sure that his goons had their gas masks secured before opening the canisters in front of the 2 teenagers. The gas roiled out in a neon electric blue. Tim held his breath, but from the few coughing gasps coming from where he knew Danny was restrained, he didn't hold out hope that Danny had stopped breathing. Eventually, Tim too had to take a breath. Scarecrow began cackling once he knew that both boys had succumbed to breathing in his newest fear toxin. "Now tell me, what are you afraid of?" Scarecrow asked Danny. He still held onto Danny's chin. Danny looked at him, and his eyes flashed green. Scarecrow startled back. "Do you really want to know?" Danny growled out. "Yes, tell me everything." Tim whimpered, but otherwise held his tongue. Danny had no such qualms. Vivisection. "That is a very specific fear," Scarecrow said slowly. How could one be afraid of vivisection? He didn't understand. He cocked his head to the side. "Warning times. By the way, it'll be over soon, I swear." Danny's eyes flashed green again, and then he gave in to the toxin. He proceeded to tell Scarecrow everything. How the GIW cut into him with ectoranium-laced scalpels. How his skin bubbled and melted at the contact. How they used a blood blossom-infused chest spreader. How they dug his eyes out to see if they would regenerate. They did, in 3 hours and 47 minutes and 52 seconds. The sound of the circular saw as it cut through his femur. The sound of tendons and muscles ripping. The citrus and ozone smell of ectoplasm mixing with the iron and rust smell of blood. The feeling of his muscles contracting as they forced thousands of volts of electricity through him time and time again to see how his ectoplasm would react. The smell of burning flesh as they did so. Somewhere in the background, Danny noted several people retching. Danny didn't care. This was his trauma. He could relive it however he wanted to. If Scarecrow wanted to know what he was afraid of, then by God and holy hell, Danny was going to make damn sure Scarecrow got what he wanted. He detailed the feeling of hands pulling out his intestines as he was force-fed so they could see how it moved through his system. How those same hands pulled and squirmed as they crawled through all of his organs. "No one could survive that!" Scarecrow finally exclaimed as Danny came to a stop. "Okay, warning over." And then, in some part of Danny's brain, the part that had been rewired in ectoplasm grinned like the little shit he was. He stopped his heart and stopped breathing. The whole commit to the bit ran through his brain as he said, "What makes you think I did?" What? Scarecrow screeched. "If you don't believe me, you can check my pulse. I'm not even breathing right now." Danny glared at the once-renowned psychologist, daring him to do exactly that. Scarecrow took Danny's wrist and found the pulse point. Not finding a pulse there, he moved his hand to the pulse point under Danny's chin. Scarecrow violently flinched when he still couldn't find a pulse in the boy. He also noted that the boy wasn't breathing, just like he claimed. Scarecrow felt like he was going to fall in the footsteps of his goons and be sick. "I don't think so."
"Jonathan Lionel Crane, you will wait here like a good little boy. You will return to Arkham, and you will stay put. You will cause no further trouble, and you will speak nothing of this encounter. Do you understand?"
Scarecrow could do nothing but nod at the order that came from the boy. Wherever this boy was, he wasn't human. Blackbat and Spoiler busted open the door to the warehouse, because where else would they be but in a fucking warehouse, and promptly secured all the goons. Most of them were begging to be arrested anyways. Scarecrow didn't even put up a fight when Spoiler put her handcuffs on him. Blackbat went over to Tim and realized that he was deep in the throes of fear toxin. "Easy, brother. Home soon," she said softly, hoping that he could hear her. Tim whimpered but went limp in his restraints. Danny's toxic green eyes watched both vigilantes warily. Spoiler bounded over to where Danny was tied up, but he growled at her and gashed his teeth at her when she got too close. Spoiler busied herself picking up the canisters so that an accurate antitoxin could be formulated when they got back to the cave. Blackbat had already released Tim and had pressed bandages to his head. Oracle, can you reach Hood? Spoiler called into her comms. Spoiler heard some clicks in her ears, and then Hood's rough voice came through her comm.
I hear you. What's the situation?
Tim and Danny Drake Wayne were kidnapped by Scarecrow. They were both exposed to his newest fear toxin, and both appear to have concussions. Danny won't let me or Blackbat anywhere near him. Maybe you can help him get home? Spoiler replied. She heard muffled cursing before Hood replied that he'd be there in a few minutes. Not even 4 minutes later, both vigilantes heard the telltale roaring of Hood's custom bike roaring into the actual warehouse. Hood pulled up in front of where Danny was still restrained in his chair. Anytime Blackbat or Spoiler got near him, he would growl and snarl at them. He kept his eyes locked on Tim as if worried they would hurt him, but he also didn't phase himself out of the restraints, like he'd forgotten he could. The moment Hood stepped in front of him, his eyes lost their toxic glow and Danny slumped forward. Hood was barely fast enough to keep him from toppling the chair over.
Fuck!
Hood exclaimed.
Oracle, can you send the Batmobile? Both our boys need to get to the cave ASAP. RR is responsive, but not lucid. Casper is unresponsive. And Scarecrow tested a new fear toxin on them.
Roger that, Hood. Batmobile ETA is 8 minutes. Oracle out. 3 vigilantes waited with bated breath. Tim was full-on whimpering. Whatever he was seeing in his nightmares was sending his heart rate spiking. Danny had gone catatonic. He hadn't restarted his breathing or his heart, and the vigilantes were worried if that would cause long-term damage in his human form. Those 8 minutes seemed like a lifetime. As soon as both Danny and Tim were loaded into the Batmobile, Spoiler and Blackbat took off on their motorcycles, leaving Hood to drive the Batmobile. By the time Hood pulled the Batmobile into the cave, Spoiler was already in the lab running an analysis to create an antidote. The centrifuge beeped as Dick and Bruce uploaded Tim and Danny from the Batmobile. Alfred was waiting in the medbay for both his charges while Steph worked with Cass. Jason, now out of his helmet, paced impatiently, having nothing to do and no way to help. Steph handed the antidote to Alfred so that it could be administered. Tim almost immediately stopped whining and whimpering. He groaned and then blinked a few times. A muttered "fuck" went unchastised for once. Then he sat upright, remembering exactly why he was in the cave. He swiveled his head around, trying to seek out his brother. He would have thrown himself out of the bed if Bruce hadn't been there to hold him down. Easy, chum. Alfred's administering the antidote now. Give it a few minutes. Bruce rumbled. You don't understand. The things Danny said. It was... I couldn't... Tears started streaming down Tim's cheeks. Even in the throes of his own fear delusions, he'd heard most of what Danny had said to Scarecrow. Bruce held his third son in his arms as Tim sobbed. Tim only hoped that Babs hadn't hacked his phone to record what had happened. But realistically, Tim didn't hold out much hope for that. Both Drake Wayne boys had gone missing. While Tim had activated his panic button and tracker before he'd gone unconscious, he was pretty sure Danny hadn't done the same. So Tim knew that Babs had probably hacked his phone. Judging from the looks on Alfred and Bruce's faces, they'd overheard what Danny had said. Alfred finally managed to get an IV line started on Danny and then pushed the antidote through his IV, instead of injecting it directly, like he'd done with Tim. He'd also started Danny on an infusion of ectoplasm, just in case. Danny seized for a moment before he uncoiled. His eyes opened, but they were hazy and unfocused. Tim begged Bruce to push the 2 beds together, if only so he could reassure himself that his brother was there. The contact seemed to help Danny become cognizant of his surroundings, and he drew in a long, hard breath. The rest of the family released the tension they'd been holding in their bodies. The monitors that Alfred had attached to Danny showed that his heart had restarted. Danny's blue eyes locked onto Tim's, and a soft smile floated across his face, and then he went unconscious again. At least he was breathing, and his heart was beating. Everything else could wait till he woke again. Notes. Danny, I'm sick, literally, because of Christmas. Here's my doctor's note. Manager, we'll do anything to keep this kid. Give some free coffee. Perla insults Danny and Tim as if Danny didn't have a built-in translator. Scarecrow, what do you fear? Danny, vivisection, then proceeds to detail his exact vivisection. Goons in the background. I'm gonna be sick. Scarecrow, how did you survive? Danny, I didn't. Scarecrow, blue screens. Danny scares the fuck out of Scarecrow and everyone else. Traumatizes the Bat Clan with the details of his vivisection. Bat Clan, what the fuck?